On a rainy morning in the corner cafe, a sharply dressed manager hurled his cold coffee at a quiet woman, then laughed at me when I stepped forward to shield her. "What are you trying to be? Some kind of hero?" He had no idea. The woman trembling behind me was the new chairwoman of the very company he was desperate to impress, and she was about to show him what real power looks like, when it doesn't need to raise its voice. Rain doesn't fall in this city. It settles. It drapes itself over the streets like a gray wool blanket, softening the edges of hurrying strangers, turning every window into a watercolor left out too long. Millie and I always claimed the same corner table at Brood Grounds, wedged between the bookshelf and the frosted window, where the radiator hummed just loud enough to drown out the world. She was 7, already the most deliberate human being I'd ever known. That morning she was drawing a house with a red door, her small tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration. This was the life I had rebuilt. Quiet, careful, held together with wood glue and Millie's laughter. The accident 2 years ago had taken many things: my position as a structural engineer, my confidence in crowded rooms, and, most visibly, the clean flow of my own words. What remained came out tangled, consonants that stuttered, syllables that doubled back on themselves like lost travelers. Speech therapy helped. Patience helped more. But the world, I had learned, is rarely patient, so I became a carpenter. I let my hands do the talking. The woman at the table beside ours had been there when we arrived. Both palms wrapped around a ceramic mug, staring into it as though searching for something she'd lost at the bottom. Her gray cardigan was slightly worn at the cuffs. Her hair was simply gathered, not styled, just held together, the way a person holds themselves when the day hasn't quite begun. She looked tired in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep. I noticed her the way you notice a quiet painting in a loud gallery. Briefly, gently, without intruding. Then the door swung open, and the morning changed. He entered the way certain men always do, as though the room had been waiting. Dark coat, sharp lapels, a phone pressed to his ear with the authority of someone who had never once been put on hold. His name, I would learn later, was Vance. He crossed the room without looking down. His shoulder caught the woman's bag. Her folder skidded across the wet floor tiles, papers scattering like leaves. Her coffee tipped, splashing across the back of her hand. She gasped, soft, startled. He glanced down at her, then at the papers, then back, calculating the cost of an apology and finding it too high. "Watch where you put your things," he said flatly. The cafe went quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of rain, but the held-breath quiet of people deciding whether to look away. Most of them did. I set down my coffee cup. Slowly, deliberately. And I stood up. The space between Vance and the woman was no more than 3 feet. I made it 2 steps. That was enough. I positioned myself between them, not aggressively, not with raised hands or a puffed chest. Simply there. A wall made of stillness. My shadow falling across his polished shoes. Vance looked up slowly, the way a man looks up when he cannot believe something as insignificant as another person has interrupted his morning. "Excuse me?" His voice was smooth, practiced. The voice of a man who had won arguments simply by sounding bored during them. I opened my mouth. The word I wanted was stop. 1 syllable, 4 letters, a word a child could say in their sleep. It did not come out that way. Please! The consonants snagged, doubled, folded back on themselves before I could catch them. My jaw tightened. I breathed, tried again. Please, just stop. The laughter came before I finished. Not laughter from the crowd. They were still frozen, still watching, still choosing the safety of silence. The laughter came from Vance alone, sharp and deliberate, shaped precisely to wound. He tilted his head, raised one eyebrow, and then, slowly, theatrically, he mimicked me, his lips moving in an exaggerated stutter, his eyes wide with mock confusion, performing my broken speech back to me like a party trick. The café held its breath. I felt Millie go very still behind me. That stillness, her stillness, steadied something in my chest. I did not clench my fists. I did not step forward. I did not give him the storm he was waiting for. I simply held my ground, keeping my body between his cruelty and the two people behind me. And I looked at him, quietly, directly, with the kind of eyes that have already survived something he never will. Something shifted in his expression. Just briefly. A crack beneath the performance. Millie moved before I did. She slid off her chair with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made up her mind, small sneakers touching the floor without a sound, and walked directly to where the $20 bill lay abandoned on the tile. She looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she picked it up with 2 fingers, the way you pick up something unclean, walked 4 steps to the left, and dropped it into the waste bin beside the counter. No announcement, no performance. Just a 7-year-old girl deciding, without hesitation, what that money was worth. A few people near the counter exchanged glances. One woman pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. Millie turned and walked back, not to me, but to the woman in the gray cardigan. She stopped in front of her and looked up with the kind of directness that only children and the very honest possess. "You can keep the handkerchief," she said. "Dad has 3 more at home. He always irons them on Sundays." The woman blinked. A sound escaped her, somewhere between a laugh and a breath she had been holding too long. Millie reached out and took her hand. Carefully. The way she held injured birds we sometimes found in the yard, firm enough to feel safe, gentle enough not to frighten. "Dad talks slow," she said simply, "but he always gets there, and he moves fast when it counts." She tilted her head, studying the woman's face with those serious brown eyes. "Don't cry, okay? The bad man is gone." Something in the woman's expression shifted, quietly, the way light shifts when clouds begin to part. She looked down at Millie, then across at me, and the tiredness in her face did not disappear. But it changed. It became something softer, something that had room in it for wonder. "What is your father's name?" she asked. Millie opened her mouth, but I was already reaching for the small notepad I kept in my jacket pocket. Old habit. Some conversations were easier on paper. I wrote 2 letters, handed it across. "Gideon." The woman read it. Her lips moved slightly, silently, as though she were placing the name somewhere careful inside herself. "Gideon," she repeated aloud, quietly, testing its weight. She folded the paper, once, then twice, and tucked it into the inside pocket of her bag. Not carelessly, not the way you pocket a receipt, the way you keep something you intend to return to. She looked at me one last time before she rose from her chair. No words, just a gaze that was steadier than anything else in that rain-gray morning, clear and unhurried and already decided. Then she buttoned her coat, lifted her bag, and walked out through the glass door into the silver rain. I watched her go. Millie leaned against my arm. "She'll remember us, Dad," she said quietly. I put my arm around her small shoulders and said nothing. But I believed her. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. He let it fall to the floor, not handed, not placed, dropped the way you discard something that has no further use. "Get yourself a speech coach," he said. Then he straightened his lapel, turned on his heel, and walked toward the door without looking back. The café exhaled. I stood there a moment longer, just to be certain he was gone, then turned around. I reached into my jacket and found what I was looking for. A single handkerchief, clean and neatly folded, the last one I'd pressed that week. I held it out toward the woman without a word. She looked at it. Then at me. Her eyes were the color of rain on old stone, gray and deep and quietly searching. She took the handkerchief. Both hands. Gently, as though it were something more than cloth. "Thank you," she said. I nodded once, and sat back down beside my daughter. The lobby of Harlow Tower smelled of polished marble and ambition. I had no business being there, not in the way the men in tailored suits had business there, with their leather portfolios and their practiced handshakes. I had come with a folded resume, a carpenter's calloused hands, and the quiet hope that the building's maintenance division might need someone who knew how things were built and how to keep them from falling apart. The receptionist had been kind. She pointed me toward the facilities office on the 3rd floor and told me to wait. I waited. The elevator opened. Vance stepped out. He was mid-sentence on his phone, loud, self-assured, filling the lobby with the sound of his own importance. He did not see me at first. Then he did. And something in his eyes shifted from surprise to amusement to the particular cruelty of a man who has found an easy target in a place where witnesses are watching. He ended his call. "Well," he said, tilting his head slowly, "the hero from the coffee shop." He let his gaze travel down to my worn jacket, my work boots, the folded resume in my hand. "Applying for a job here?" A thin smile. "Let me guess. Janitor?" A few people in the lobby glanced over. I said nothing. "Do us all a favor," he continued, his voice dropping just low enough to feel private, just loud enough to carry. "Some places have standards. You should find somewhere more, suited to your level." He turned to the security desk. "Could someone please escort this gentleman out? He seems to be in the wrong building." The guard rose from his chair, apologetic eyes, following orders. I picked up my bag. I did not argue. I did not perform anger for the room. I simply turned toward the door. And in that moment, the elevator at the far end of the lobby opened with a soft chime. The sound of footsteps crossed the marble floor. Measured, unhurried, certain. I recognized her before I fully turned around. Not because of what she was wearing, though the charcoal suit was impeccable, the kind of garment that does not announce itself but simply belongs. I recognized her because of the stillness she carried. The same stillness from the café, distilled now into something sharper, something with edges. Serene. The room noticed her the way rooms notice people who have stopped needing to be noticed. Vance turned, smiled, extended his hand with the smooth reflex of a man who reads name badges and adjusts accordingly. "Ms. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Vance Aldrich, Senior Director at Meridian Capital. I believe we have a meeting this morning regarding the Harlow partnership." "We did," she said. Past tense. Quiet as a closed door. She did not take his hand. "I received your firm's proposal last week," she continued, her voice carrying no heat, only clarity, the kind that needs no volume to fill a room. "I've reviewed it thoroughly, and I've made my decision." She paused. Meridian Capital's contract with Harlow Group is terminated, effective today. My office will send the formal notice within the hour. Vance's smile did not disappear immediately. It took a moment, like a light flickering before it goes out entirely. I don't understand. There must be some mistake. If we could just sit down and... There is no mistake. She turned, away from him, fully, without ceremony, and looked at me. Her expression shifted. Not dramatically. Just the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. Gideon. Her voice was the same as I remembered. Quiet, unhurried, like rain on old stone. I've been hoping to find you. I have a position that needs filling. Director of Facilities Management. Someone who understands how things are built. A pause. The smallest trace of warmth at the corners of her eyes. Someone who moves fast when it counts. The lobby was completely silent. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I nodded. Once. Slowly. And this time, for the first time in a long time, the word came out clean. Yes. She came on a Saturday. No announcement, no assistant calling ahead. Just a knock at the workshop door, 3 quiet taps. And when I opened it, Seren was standing on the step in a plain cream sweater and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding a paper bag that smelled of warm bread and coffee. I hope this is all right, she said. Millie told me Saturdays are workshop days. I stepped aside to let her in. The space was small and smelled of cedar and linseed oil. Sawdust caught the afternoon light in slow, golden drifts. Half-finished chairs leaned against one wall. A rocking horse stood in the corner, nearly done, its mane carved in careful, flowing lines that had taken me 3 evenings to get right. Seren moved through it slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything. The way a person walks through a place they want to understand, rather than simply see. Millie appeared from behind the workbench, wood shavings in her hair, a small chisel in her hand that she was absolutely not supposed to be holding unsupervised. Seren! She set the chisel down with the casual guilt of someone who had been caught doing exactly what she intended. Dad said you might come. I saved you the good stool. The good stool was a 3-legged thing I had made years ago, slightly uneven on the left side. My first real attempt at joinery. I had always meant to fix it. I never did. Seren sat on it without hesitation. We spent the afternoon like that, the 3 of us in the small, warm space, wood shavings on the floor, rain beginning again outside the single window. Millie talked constantly. I worked. Seren watched and occasionally asked questions about the grain of the wood, about how long certain pieces took, about whether the rocking horse was for someone specific. I shook my head, picked up my notepad, wrote, "Just for whoever needs it." She read it, smiled, not the careful, composed expression I had seen in the lobby of Harlow Tower, but something smaller and more unguarded. Something that belonged only here, in the sawdust and the quiet. At some point, Millie produced a sheet of paper and drew the 3 of us. Tall figures, crooked lines, a roof overhead. She wrote our names carefully beneath each one. No quotation marks around Seren's, no hesitation. Just 3 names, side by side, like they had always belonged together.
Dear friend, the story you have just followed is a work of fiction, carefully crafted from the very real emotions of longing, injustice, and the quiet courage it takes to remain decent in an indecent moment. The characters are not real, but the pain of being mocked for something beyond your control, the loneliness of a crowd that looks away, the small, extraordinary weight of a child's hand reaching for a stranger, these are not invented. These live in the world we share every day. This story carries one truth at its center. Never confuse the smoothness of a man's words with the strength of his character. A well-dressed voice can belong to an empty soul, and a man who struggles to speak, who fights for every syllable, can carry within him a courage that the loudest person in the room will never touch. Kindness does not make noise. It is proven in action. Quiet bravery always finds its own way of rewriting the rules. Thank you for always choosing to stand on the side of decency.